The state of the political dynamics in Britain are the wildest they have ever been in our lifetimes. There are some very curious characters all around Westminster. Some shady and villainous, some stuffy and bland, many quite robotic, and perhaps most of all, many out of their depth. Yet one of the longest and best-known characters, who has been a mainstay in British discourse for decades, now appears poised to be Prime Minister at the next general election, or a cautionary tale of hubris and downfall. There are really only a few outcomes for this character, yet one thing that is certain is that he has made an enormous mark that has shaped much of the United Kingdom and the Anglosphere today. This is Nigel Farage. Some may see him as the great hero of reform, the wild outsider. Perhaps he's the lovable everyman, the answer to the question of who you would most like to get a drink with. Yet to others, he's just the same system repeating itself, a slimy backstabber. He is Mr Brexit to many, a vile extremist to others, and a deceptive Machiavellian Blairite in disguise. So how can this one figure be so many different characters to so many different people? And who is he really? Now, as Reform UK are leading in the polls, this is a fascinating and important character that warrants very close inspection. So we will see his story and who he really is. Mr Brexit, Mr UKIP. This is Nigel Farage and his story. Nigel was born Nigel Paul Farage on April 3, 1964, in Farnborough, Kent. His mother was Barbara Farage, and his father was Guy Justice Oscar Farage. Barbara, born 1931, in Lambeth, was described as vivacious. She and Guy would raise Nigel and his siblings, yet after his father would leave, in the midst of a period of serious problems with alcohol, she would raise the children alone. His father, born in 1935, was the son of a City of London stockbroker, a profession which he himself would follow in. Guy Farage was known as flamboyant and a great storyteller, being remarked upon as the best-dressed man on the London Stock Exchange. Though he was quite personable, likable, and well-presented, he was an alcoholic, a problem which got sufficiently bad that he left Barbara along with Nigel and his siblings in 1969, when Nigel was only 5. Ultimately, this period would lead to him giving up alcohol, ultimately quitting in 1971. He would, however, lose his job as a stockbroker and become an antiquities trader, before returning to stock brokerage the following year in 1972. Nigel would grow up in the Kent village of Down, though he would generally recount his childhood quite fondly. This period of family trouble and the ensuing divorce would be quite disruptive and take a substantial toll on the young Nigel. During his childhood in the early 1970s, he would attend Greenhays School for Boys in West Wickham, followed by a short period at a similar school in Eden Park. Though he would describe his family troubles as having blighted his early education, he would develop an interest in cricket, rugby, and ultimately political debate. His family would emphasize patriotism, heavily influenced by relatives' experiences during the World Wars. At age 10, following his passing of the Common Entrance exam, he would enroll at Dulwich College, a prestigious private school in South London. The school staff would be described as terrifying and tough, made up heavily of World War II veterans. And Nigel himself had quite a personality. He was highly argumentative, being described as a yob with a gob. He quite enjoyed provoking other students and teachers, stirring up trouble just for its own sake, though generally through speaking, using his words for provocation. It would be during these years that he would become increasingly fascinated with politics, particularly influenced by visits from politicians like Ed Heath and Enoch Powell. At age 14, he would join the Conservative Party after a school visit by Keith Joseph. He would generally align with a sort of conservative liberalism, though he very much enjoyed provocation, and quite often he would do this by professing extreme ideas, making extremist claims to see what responses he would get, or to drag people into argument. At age 17, controversy would arise after school staff would debate his suitability to be appointed as a prefect due to his alleged publicly professed racist and neo-fascist views. English teacher Chloe Deacon would write to the school's headmaster, David Ems, saying that Nigel had a fascination with the far right, engaged in bullying, and had been goose-stepping during cadet marches. He would be appointed anyway, with headmaster Ems viewing it as naughtiness and not racism. Nigel would later describe assertions of his extremism as ridiculous. This would be corroborated by other students. What was quite evident to everyone was that he was a provocateur. He generally aligned with the conservative view and broader British liberalism, but he loved getting reactions, and had found that professing extreme views was a way to get such reactions. In 1982, at age 18, he would leave Dulwich without pursuing a university education. This was quite atypical for his position at such a school. He would instead enter into the city, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather, going to work as a commodities trader on the London Metals Exchange. Britain's mid-century had begun with the period of the post-war consensus, stable with social cohesion, though with persistent economic troubles. Following the Second World War, Britain had become highly socialized, high taxes, heavy government control, and an incredibly powerful grip maintained by the unions. Britain's economy, particularly by the 1970s, was not good. Yet as Nigel left school in 1982, he arrived for the beginning of an entirely new economic period in Britain. Under the Prime Ministership of Margaret Thatcher, there would be sweeping deregulation and privatization. The British economy would begin to grow rapidly in a way that it hadn't in decades, and for those in the financial sector in the City of London, the enormous wave of deregulation, the Big Bang, would create an environment that made this the perfect time for Nigel to enter. Finance was booming. Many new players in the city were getting rich fast. There was a lot more freedom, a lot more leverage, and if you were a bold young man entering the City of London in the 1980s, you were going to have a lot of fun. Upon entering the city, Nigel would join the American commodity operation of Drexel Burnham Lambert, working out of their London office. He would be focused on the metals market, a market which would thrive in the deregulated environment. Immediately, he would be recognized as charismatic and as a natural salesman. These years as a young trader seemed to be very fruitful and enjoyable for Nigel, who enjoyed the fast pace and aggressive environment of a commodities trading pit of the 1980s. However, in 1985, at age 21, he would be severely injured in a car accident. After leaving a pub in Kent, he would be hit by a VW Beetle while crossing the road. He would be thrown by the car, landing on his head, suffering a serious injury to his leg, significant head trauma, and many other downstream complications. He would spend 2 months in the hospital, with a leg cast which he needed for a year. However, for as brutal as this sounds, this period wasn't all bad for him. While recovering, he would meet his first wife, Grana Hayes, a nurse working at the hospital. He would describe this experience as quite life-changing, imparting to him a sense that he should seize opportunities. The following year, he would be back in the city, joining Crédit Lyonnais Russe, which has since become a part of Crédit Agricole, continuing to work as a commodities trader focused in the metals market. This year would be another whirlwind in his life. He would be diagnosed with testicular cancer, requiring a surgery for its removal. From this he would recover, and he would enter into his first marriage. The couple would have 2 sons, born in 1988 and 1991. However, they would divorce in 1997. In 1989, at age 25, some of his trademark Euroscepticism would begin to become evident. He would vote for the Green Party in European Parliament, as he was becoming increasingly dissatisfied of the direction that European integration was going with respect to Britain. He was beginning to diverge from the Conservatives, and the main crux of this disagreement was European integration. There's something quite curious about the relationship between the City of London and the European Union. Early on, many in the city were European integrationists. On the one hand, there were many of the British upper class who had coalesced around liberal universalism, believing in international institutions and the breaking down of borders and peoples. Yet, particularly in the financial end of the British ruling class, there were many who viewed the European Union as an opportunity to pit the French and the Germans against each other and squish them down. However, as European integration went on, there were some who were beginning to become skeptical. Sentiment wasn't quite as unified in London as it was within many of the European financial hubs. In fact, there have been some quite Eurosceptic financiers. Sir James Goldsmith, a very wealthy and very successful corporate raider of this era, had come from the German-Jewish Goldschmidt banking family, the founders of the Goldschmidt Family Bank. His father had been a very successful British hotelier and a member of Parliament. Sir James would found the Referendum Party in 1994, being a quite early example of explicitly calling for Britain to separate itself off from Europe, and to do so via referendum. City financier Stuart Wheeler, the founder of IG Index, a highly successful spread betting firm, would become a major conservative donor to many of the Brexit campaigns later on. Norman Lamont, who had been Chancellor from 1990 to 1993, had been a Rothschild banker earlier in his career. Though he wouldn't be explicitly anti-Europe, he would show some quite noticeable reservations. In fact, the Rothschilds themselves would show some uncertainty, though there would be family members who were overtly pro-EU. Lord Jacob would enter into a short Euro trade in 2012. Now, this wasn't an overt, clear anti-Europe stance, and he was not a noted Eurosceptic. But through actions like these, there are examples of British financiers showing questions of confidence in respect to the European Union. There were mixed motivations and mixed goals in the city, and Euroscepticism would grow increasingly in the 21st century. The relationship between the EU and the City of London is a really tricky and nuanced one, because while many would be inclined to think that the City of London and the Brussels bureaucrats are all the same international globalist elite, there are different factions and there are different viewpoints. Some viewed the European Union as useful, yet others, over time, began to feel that European regulations were stifling their businesses. At age 28, Nigel would leave the Conservative Party in a protest over John Major's signing of the Maastricht Treaty, joining the Anti-Federalist League. The following year, he would become a founding member of UKIP, the UK Independence Party, now focusing himself on withdrawing from the European Union. He would continue as a commodities trader over these years, though would increasingly become more politically active. The following year, at age 30, he would join Refco, a US-based brokerage firm, and during the same year establish his own brokerage business, Farage Futures, a futures brokerage focused on the metals market. Contemporaries would describe him as a skilled salesman with a combative trading style. He was doing very well in the city, though more and more he was focusing on the politics of the European Union. And at the same time, UKIP began gaining traction. As a member of UKIP, he would stand as a candidate for MP in Salisbury in the 1997 general election. He would receive around 3% of the vote. The same year, he would get divorced. However, the following year he would become the chairman of UKIP, and he would remarry to Kristen Mayer, a German bond trader that he met in Frankfurt in 1999. They would have 2 daughters, born in 1999 and 2004. Whatever this period did do to him psychologically, this was a quite sizable transition period in his life, beginning to make the jump into dedicating himself to politics. He would remain in finance until June of 1999, where he would stand as a candidate for European Parliament. Now, despite making the jump into a political career, there was still some degree of trading which he continued to engage in, though it would decrease substantially, and he would ultimately return to a lesser degree in 2003 when he would join the Texas Metals. Though going into the 21st century, it was now safe to say that his profession was as a politician. In June of 1999, Nigel Farage was 35 years old, and he was now an MEP for South East England, representing UKIP. He had now done it. He had become a real politician. However, neither UKIP nor the European Parliament were taken particularly seriously in Britain at this point. There was certainly public opinion on European Parliament, but it was quite an afterthought compared to the actual government of the United Kingdom, and UKIP just wasn't taken very seriously as a party. However, Nigel had identified that there was an enormous disconnect between the British elite and the general public. He realized that the Euroscepticism of the public was much more pronounced than existed within Westminster and the broader ruling class, and what he really capitalized on was his ability to speak to the common man. He began to cultivate an image as being a plain, direct speaker, someone who would speak the sort of common wisdom of the everyman at the pub. He would begin leaning into this image visually, sometimes dressing more working class, smoking a cigarette, and despite being a quite middle-class City of London commodities trader who had come from an elite private school, he was Nige round a pub. As in, yeah, this old balmy codswallop these geezers in Brussels is saying, not our Nige, he tells it like it is. Okay, not quite like that, but you get the point. He had also identified a very comfy life, because being a member of European Parliament was a very comfy job. So he could be a quite wealthy man, living a luxurious lifestyle as a member of European Parliament, all while basing his entire career around telling people how awful his job is, and how Britain should leave the European Union. His entire purpose was telling people that he should not be, while simultaneously being and getting a very nice lifestyle out of it. It was sort of the perfect circular problem. A wealthy elite man, who acts like the common man and tells them how awful the elite are, and how they should leave Europe, using this as a means to secure his seat in Europe. Now, some saw this as him being a hard-working crusader, one who spoke what the common man thought. Yet others began to see this as a bit of a grift. There was quite a divide on just how much to trust Nigel and his act. Perhaps he was being honest and upfront. He was speaking plainly because this is what he believed. And he did have quite a track record of very serious Euroscepticism. Yet there was a troubling disconnect. He was building a very comfortable lifestyle and a celebrity status for himself, all based on telling people, no, I shouldn't be doing this. And this tension would only add to his controversy. A controversy that would begin to grow as he would become more and more theatric and outspoken over the following years. There is an odd tension that he has never resolved within his image. On the one hand, he tries to maintain this sense of being like the common man, but on the other, he likes to talk about his success in the city. Now, did he do well in finance? Yes, by all accounts, he seemed to do reasonably well. But was he some big, powerful financier? No, he was not some big power player. He was a young guy in the city during a boom time. And that isn't a mark against him, but he certainly wasn't Lord Rothschild financing the Suez Canal. As he entered into European Parliament, and as the years went on, he would maintain some of his city relationships, however, building up relationships with financiers and managers, figures like Crispin O'Day, who would become future Brexit supporters. And as so much of his career was becoming image and media-based, he would increasingly cultivate relationships with media figures in the United Kingdom, beginning one that would become much more substantial later on in his life, Rupert Murdoch, whose papers like The Sun quite prominently gave space to Eurosceptic views. Papers and media companies which would later on play a role in the Brexit campaign. Things seemed to be going quite well for Nigel as the 21st century began. He would be UKIP chairman from 1998 to 2000. He would co-chair the Independence and Democracy group in European Parliament, and his image would grow and grow. Yet his life would continue to be dogged by scares and tragedies. He would face a testicular cancer scare in 2006, and in 2010, during a campaign event, he would sustain head injuries in a plane crash after a plane towing a Vote UKIP banner would crash in Northamptonshire. His career was rising. His image was becoming more well-known. and his relationships were becoming more substantial. Going into the 2010s, he would continue to focus on growing his media relationships, with Nigel Farage the character overtaking Nigel Farage the man. And all the while he would cultivate relationships with more financiers, businessmen, and managers. Figures like Aaron Banks, an insurance tycoon who would become a major UKIP donor. He was a solitary juxtaposition. His image was based entirely on contrast with the metropolitan elite, a class which was at the core of his criticism. His whole premise was that the elite were out of touch. Those in Westminster, and particularly those in Brussels. Yet he was also becoming a quite well-connected man within the elite of Fleet Street and the City of London. He never quite left that middle-class elite private school City of London boy world, and those were the very people in his life. Yet outwardly, he had to be the very opposite, and at this point this balance seemed to have found success. In 2006 he had been elected the leader of UKIP, and this would prove to be a very good time for the party. Questions around immigration and sovereignty were beginning to emerge, and as the excitement of cool Britannia and the Blair Revolution was beginning to cool into a bland simmer, with dissatisfaction in Labour and the Conservatives rising, UKIP would begin gaining in local elections. They would never become a real parliamentary party, yet their local council presence would be quite noteworthy. In November of 2009, he would resign as UKIP leader to contest the 2010 general against Commons Speaker John Bercow in Buckingham. He would finish third in that election, and this is quite emblematic of something that will re-emerge again and again over the story of Nigel Farage. He joins things, leaves things, shows up places, and disappears from places all the time. It would become quite common for him to enter into a position only to shortly leave that position, only to come back to enter into that position again before leaving it. He was the sort of politician who would see an opportunity, parachute into a constituency, run, fail, go back to his old position, find a new constituency he could parachute into and run for that. A politician which Americans of the 19th century termed carpetbaggers. After being re-elected as an MEP in 2009, he would begin placing more and more of his focus on media stunts and growing his image. He would begin to acquire a celebrity status, making use of wild theatrics and media stunts, such as famously referring to EU President Herman van Rompuy as having the charisma of a damp rag and the appearance of a low-grade bank clerk. After a leadership challenge, he would be re-elected as UKIP's leader in 2010, serving until 2016. And over these years, the vote share for UKIP would surge. He would further strengthen his alliance with financiers and with media figures. Everything seemed to be only getting better for UKIP and for Nigel. In 2014, UKIP would win European elections with 27.5% of the vote, the first time that a party that was neither Labour nor the Conservatives would top a national poll since 1906. In May of 2015, he would contest South Thanet in a general election, suffering a narrow loss. He would then briefly resign as UKIP leader before being reinstated shortly thereafter. Yet in these years, something was changing. There was a new mood in the air. Nigel and UKIP were more than theatrical figures who were able to connect with the common man, mainstays in British politics, but ultimately a protest vote more than much of anything else. For in the heart of the 2010s, support for leaving Europe was rising. A British European Union exit, or we have to come up with a word for that, was now something that was being discussed with more seriousness. There were a number of problems facing Britain. Economically, following the 2008 financial crisis, things had really never gotten good again. All the while, the regulations of Europe were strangulating. The heavy regulatory environment of the European Union was onerous to businesses across Britain. It was onerous to the common people, as it was onerous to the City of London. And more people were questioning as to whether bureaucrats in Brussels should have this much of a say over what the British do. Yet there was a problem that was much, much deeper. Immigration. Immigration to the United Kingdom had been rising since the start of the 21st century, and now in the middle of the 2010s, it was beginning to really cause alarm. Britons found that their towns were becoming increasingly unrecognizable. that there were constituencies that British peoples themselves didn't have any control over. People in some parts of Britain were beginning to feel alien in their own homes, and incidents of crime and violence were getting worse. Britons were becoming dissatisfied with immigration policy, and they wanted the right to say no. However, the only problem with that, at least that they thought, was that the United Kingdom had become bound by European rules and conventions on immigration. And so, as more Britons wanted these waves of immigration to end, many came to believe that the only path forward was to leave the European Union and its rules. And for Nigel Farage, this was his main thing. Brexit was him. This was the entire point of his entire career. And as he had become a celebrity for opposing British integration into the European Union, it was self-evident that he would become the face of the British exit. Brexit. With the media and financial ties that he had cultivated over the prior decades, he would garner enormous support for the Leave campaign, acting as a sort of mascot for Brexit. The government would put the question to a vote. At large, the British elite believed that the population was not going to vote to leave. However, this belief only further proved the point of the disconnect between the elite and the general population. To the British elite, the point of liberalism was globalism. The entire social, philosophical worldview. The entire point of everything was to integrate globally, to break down borders and become an international brotherhood of man. As Britain's elite had become so disconnected from the realities of the population, as their economic reality had drifted further and further away from Britons, and as they had become largely isolated from the effects of mass migration, the idea that the population was dissatisfied with the entire premise of globalist integration was simply unfathomable. Yet as the vote neared, some began to become more worried. Yet generally, they still believed that it was quite unlikely. After all the polls were saying that the Remain vote would win out. And so, as the polls would close in June of 2016, it would be a great shock to the ruling class when the United Kingdom would vote Leave. In the days leading up to the Brexit vote, polls had been showing an expected 55-45 vote split in favor of remaining. Yet when the vote was actually counted, the results would be 52-48 Leave. Certainly, the success of the Brexit vote cannot entirely be placed on Nigel Farage. His branding may depict Brexit as entirely him, but it was a much larger campaign with much deeper and wider dissatisfaction. However, he was the figure of the movement. He was its mascot, and he was an enormous campaigner, and more than that, a hub for donors. One area in which Nigel was quite strong was that he was able to pull together financial support from British businessmen, all while maintaining a mascot image and working quite well with the media. The media had been villainizing him, depicting him as some kind of awful, backward radical, some kind of hate-filled lunatic who wanted to leave the glorious future of international love and brotherhood and bring everyone back to the dark ages of wrathful, isolated Britain. And while this made him a very polarizing figure, it made him a very famous one, and this he used to his advantage. However, a curiosity about Nigel is while the entire premise of his character and his career is to be an oppositional figure, he has reliably shown discomfort with ever being too attacked by British media. It certainly appears as though he wants to fit in. He wants to be in the Westminster and the city dinner parties, and one thing he most certainly does not want is for Fleet Street to call him a racist. This is a very tricky tension at the core of Nigel and the Nigel character. He wants to be the outsider, he wants to be the rebel, but he also wants to be accepted by the elite. He wants to be the man who smashed the European Union. Yet for much of his life, he was a quite comfortable member of European Parliament. He wants to be seen as the common man. Yet it's also important to him that everyone knows that he was a great City of London traitor. Yet now the Brexit vote had been passed, and so he thought his work was done. Following the Brexit vote, Nigel would resign from leading UKIP. He would pivot to trying to build a sort of transatlantic populist brand, particularly attempting to build ties with Donald Trump. Donald Trump, who was at this point running for President of the United States. He would leave European Parliament by mocking them, delivering a quite famous speech in which he mocks, "You're not laughing at me now." Many would call out for Nigel to stay, to become a part of the Brexit itself. Yet it appeared as though he had set his sights on something different. He was going to become entirely a media figure. He would associate with more populist figures around the world, and he would bask in his new image, Mr. Brexit. After resigning as leader of UKIP, Nigel would say, "I want my life back." He would begin hosting on LBC radio, focusing on building his media brand. Quite early on, in August of 2016, he would speak at a Donald Trump rally in Mississippi. It would be there that he would be bestowed his new moniker, Mr. Brexit. He would continue as a radio host from 2017 to 2018, fully resigning from UKIP in December of 2018, citing a, quote, far-right shift that had occurred under its leadership. Things seemed to be going well for Nigel. He no longer had to worry about politics. He was a quite famous and wealthy figure, well-connected, and he had a great political triumph to his name. Yet by this point, Brexit still hadn't happened. The people of the United Kingdom, including a fair amount who had voted Remain, were beginning to become quite frustrated with the inaction of Parliament. Again and again, new Brexit deals would go through only to be stalled out and end up going nowhere. It was becoming evident that the government did not want a Brexit to happen, and that the vote meant very little to them. There would even be some quite substantial campaigns to have a re-vote, the argument being, well, people were just voting out of frustration. If they knew that the Leave vote would actually win, they would have voted differently. Yet this clear contempt for the population was just too far. Many Remainers were fed up with it, holding the position of, well, I didn't want it, but that's what the vote said, so do it. And more people wanted Nigel to come back. As he had been such a force behind Brexit in the first place, many felt betrayed that he had left them just before it had actually seen success. He may have gotten the vote through, but now that the time had come to actually leave, he was off being a celebrity. And in 2019, he would co-found the Brexit Party. Nigel, along with property tycoon Richard Tice, and trader and hotelier Catherine Blakelock, would bring about a new political party, dedicated to one simple issue, Brexit actually happening. Nigel would begin this endeavor, stating a "No more Mr. Nice Guy" pledge. A major early backer of the party would be Aaron Banks. In May of that year, the Brexit Party would begin to win European elections, securing 29 MEPs and 31.6% of the vote. With this clear presence, they would begin to apply pressure into British government, closing the walls in on Theresa May. Ultimately, they would be a quite powerful contributor to the pressure that led to Theresa May's resignation. Britons were getting fed up, and they just wanted a Brexit. And the pressure was particularly high at this point, for there was a general election coming up. The Brexit Party would run its candidates, taking the position that the government had betrayed the Brexit vote. Yet throughout November and December of that year, with the direction of Nigel, the Brexit Party would begin to stand down their candidates. Though it can't be entirely certain how the vote would have gone otherwise, the end result was 317 Tory seats. The Brexit Party had aided the victory of the Tories and had secured a prime ministership for Boris Johnson. Johnson had stood with the position that he was going to, quote, get Brexit done. And ultimately, in January of 2020, the United Kingdom would leave the European Union. It seemed as though Brexit had finally been done. However, the United Kingdom had entered into a set of new agreements, many applying similar, or in some cases more onerous restrictions than had existed under Europe. The United Kingdom was as well on the hook for any damages caused to the European Union for the following 10 years. The Brexit deal was not what people had hoped for, and it looked quite evident that this was just a new way to smuggle in the globalist international state project, but unofficially. The next year, the Brexit Party would be renamed no longer did the goal of a Brexit seem to make much sense, and so the anti-Europeanist rebels would come up with a new name, one that would really capture that wild outsider spirit, something that says smash the old ways. Reform. Very bold, very radical. Richard Tice would become the leader of the newly branded Reform UK in March of 2021, while Nigel would go on to be a host for GB News, launching that year. He would continue to grow his network, including figures like hedge fund manager and media tycoon Paul Marshall, the owner of GB News, Unheard, and The Spectator. By this point, under the prime ministership of Boris Johnson, Nigel was focusing primarily on his media efforts. He would build up much closer ties with Rupert Murdoch, and while he would cultivate his transatlantic populist brand, the populists in the United States and those in the orbit of Donald Trump would begin to demonstrate some distance. There was something that just felt off about Nigel. Many were beginning to become wearier of him, how easily he jumped ship, how obsessed with media and celebrity he seemed to be, and perhaps most of all, how willing to backstab he appeared. After being smeared and kicked out of the party, Rupert Lowe has told a story from this time period that led to him seriously beginning to doubt Nigel. He details that businessman and investor Christopher Harborne had been a quite sizable donor to UKIP and the Brexit Party, being a financial backer of the Brexit campaign, yet that the same figure would also be a large donor to Boris Johnson. Still, donors fund multiple sides in politics all the time. Yet one thing that was quite eerie about this situation was that Boris Johnson was not given money prior to nor during his time as Prime Minister. Harborne would pay Johnson after, in a way which appeared, at least to Lowe, as payments for services rendered. Yet this is just one instance of a much larger phenomenon. The same wealthy media, business, and financial figures that were backing the Tories, backing Johnson, and backing the establishment were the very same people who were backing Nigel. They were the very same people who Nigel had his closest relationships with. So was Nigel really the rebel that he appeared to be? Well, more and more as time went on, the answer appeared to be no. Later, Nigel would refer to himself as the last chance that the liberal establishment has. And this is where we really see the crux of the deviation between his character and his person. His character is like the common man. His character tells it like it is, and is the outsider. He's the one who will shake things up. But the man is an entity of the City of London. He's financed by the same people who finance the establishment. And he does not want to break the paradigm. Reform UK. That's a very curious name. More straightforwardly, the idea that the upstart anti-establishment party would be called Reform is quite curious. Yet more than that, they chose the name UK, a term which is actually quite novel, at least in terms of heavy usage. People had always referred to entities like England, Scotland, Wales, or perhaps Britain, or the United Kingdom, the country ultimately being the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But UK, just the initials, that has a very strong association with the Blairite paradigm. This entity, the UK, whether spelled a U and a K, or UK, and you know what spelling I mean, that's something that connotes modernity and the modern establishment. So what is the name of the party? It's Reform the Establishment. Yet still, in summer of 2024, when Nigel would return as the leader of Reform UK, there would be a great deal of enthusiasm. The dominant parties were simply becoming too reviled. And maybe if people didn't truly believe that Nigel was the character Nigel, nor that Reform really were these outsiders they appeared to be, they were something different, and they were promising change. Nigel would run for MP in Clacton, being elected on July 4th of 2024, and for a quite novel party, Reform would do very well, winning 5 seats and 14% of the vote. They would begin to ally with establishment defectors, figures like Lee Anderson and Rupert Lowe. and there was some energy that was consolidating around reform. Even with reservations, many believed that perhaps this could be a vehicle for change. And meanwhile, the more ardent leftists referred to it as some sort of radical, hard-right extremist party. So that did give them some bona fides with the dissatisfied young and working class. It was a very curious image. They projected outsider, yet stated that they intended to save the liberal establishment. They began to take many positions that were, in some cases, softer than Labour on immigration, yet meanwhile would be attacked from the left, as though they were radicals. The country didn't quite know how to place the party. Many assumed that they were these wild radicals, while many looked at them and saw the establishment. And much of this can be laid at the feet of Nigel himself. For the driving force behind Reform UK was not the party Reform UK. It was the character of Nigel. And Nigel had spent decades being a wild, theatrical figure, intentionally being polarizing, and having the media's aid in that endeavor, with wild theatrics and statements from many different angles. If you wanted to see a statement that sounded hardline on immigration, that sounded anti-establishment, then you could find evidence of Nigel saying such a thing. Yet if one wanted to paint him as if he were a Labour MP, one could find just those statements. There wasn't a clear belief set. There was a feeling, there was a character, and there was Nigel Farage. And at the moment, a bit disjointed, yes, but there was serious momentum. That was until things began to change. In July of 2024, the new chairmanship of Zaya Yousaf would be announced. So who is Zaya Yousaf? No one knows. Who is this guy? Well, so the story goes, Nigel had met Zaya in a cocktail party hosted by Stuart Wheeler in 2023. And in the run-up to the 2024 election, he had become the largest donor to the party. Early in his career, Yousaf had been quite successful in large investment banks, rising to be an executive director at Goldman Sachs. From there, he'd leave to form a luxury concierge company, Velocity Black. So what does this company do? It gets you places. Things like tickets or special seats. It gets you into stuff. Or at least it tries to. There has been a very mixed reception on how well it works. Yet nonetheless it was sold to Capital One for £233 million, earning Yousaf £31 million personally, money which he used to become a large political donor and seemingly buy Reform UK. So how did the nativist Britons, who felt as though they were being replaced in their own country, who were suspicious of the establishment and international capital and financiers, who had great grievances with the system and a distrust of technology companies, the people of the shires, the working class, the young, the ones particularly concerned about the presence of Islam, how did they feel about some shadowy Sri Lankan Muslim businessman showing up and buying their outsider party? Not good. Yet Reform would continue to grow, but with some changes. Much of their outsiders and their right flank would be cut out. People who had helped to build the party would simply be gouged. The party was going in a different direction. It wanted to appeal more to the center. This was building some serious resentment. And yet the one that would be the most galvanizing of all would be the removal of Rupert Lowe. So the story from Farage and Yousaf would be that Lowe had been responsible for repeated bullying in his office, and also that he had threatened to kill Zaya Yousaf. Police would be sent to Lowe's house, and his firearms would be taken, where he would be investigated. An investigation which went nowhere, because in the words of Nigel Farage, Lowe's immigration policy had been far too radical. We had to get rid of him, joking that perhaps he had been a bit too harsh. You notice there's nothing about bullying or threatening to kill Yousaf. And so, in the past month, Lowe has launched Restore Britain, a campaign immediately flocked to by nativists, the right, and outsiders. And this is the problem right at the heart of Nigel the character and Reform UK today. For the outsider party has been bringing on defectors from Labour and the Conservative Party, let's take a look at his front bench team, his termed shadow cabinet. For while not officially in opposition, at least as of now, they continue to poll as the largest party. Deputy Leader, Head of the Department of Government Efficiency, and Secretary for Trade, Business, and Energy, Richard Tice. The Shadow Chancellor, Robert Jenrick. Head of Policy and Home Affairs, Zaya Youssef. The Head of Preparation for Government, Danny Kruger. Education, Skills, and Equality, Suella Braverman. And Chief Whip, Lee Anderson. And as more and more of the party becomes made up of not only former Conservative MPs, but Labour as well, the party has arrived at a ship of Theseus problem. Is this just a rebranding of the Blair establishment? For after flipping on issue upon issue, after taking positions softer than Labour, for being surrounded by and funded by figures from Fleet Street and the city, to the point where some shadowy Indian Muslim financier appears to have bought the chairmanship, after kicking out and backstabbing so many of the people who were there building it at the beginning. What is the party? And what is the character of Nigel? Well, perhaps it is exactly as he has said, the last chance for the liberal establishment. Nigel is a fascinating character, one who has had a history of extraordinary success across politics and media, one who has managed a brand for decades. He's an outsized figure, one known across the country and internationally. But he is not an outsider. He is not the rebel. Nor is he trusted by those who trusted him. He appears to be slippery, a Machiavellian backstabber. He appears to be self-absorbed, concerned with his image and terrified of being too smeared. And just as it has been again and again over his lifetime, he never stopped being that City of London traitor. He never stopped being that elite private school boy. He's a wild and theatrical character, but he does not want to tear down the thing that he loves, the thing that made him. So perhaps he will be the next Prime Minister, but particularly in the case of the next election occurring in 2029, there is great risk that momentum is moving against him. The situation is becoming darker, and people are becoming much more serious. The population is losing faith in the credibility of reform, both the concept and the party. So the question for the party and the question for Nigel is, will he be that last chance for the liberal establishment? That's what he is. That's what the party is. The old major parties are becoming more and more hated, and it appears as though reform is now a referendum on giving the Blair establishment one last chance. It looks quite clear that Nigel will not be that radical outsider who smashes the system. Yet the question that remains is, will he be the final one in 10 Downing Street to go down with that ship?